I'm Andrea Retzky. I'm a writer, an editor, and a communication strategist. And this presentation is about storytelling, specifically how to tell the story of what you learned in this I-Corps session. 2 years ago, I was sitting where you are, running my initial business thesis through the I-Corps process, participating in a cohort just like this one. Even though I'm a communicator, I still face challenges in putting together my I-Corps story. I learned from that, and I hope that what I share with you today will help you to put together your presentation. Today, we're going to talk about what makes a story a good and memorable one, and look at the key components that you need to include specific to this I-Corps cohort. Why does storytelling matter in this course? Your final assignment, as you can see in the syllabus, is to present your overall I-Corps journey with an 8-minute PowerPoint presentation that captures your business thesis and key outcomes and includes certain core elements. That means you need to tell the story of what you did and what you learned during this I-Corps session. As an entrepreneur, you must be able to tell your story. By doing so, you provide a framework for customers, investors, partners, even employees to get on board with your idea and your vision. Every successful entrepreneur must learn to be a storyteller in some capacity. We share or enjoy stories all the time, right? When you're trying to make a point in a meeting, when you're out with your friends, when you're streaming a show, or when you're scrolling through social media. It's human nature to tell stories and to want to hear stories, especially when they're good. And what makes them good? There's two parts to consider, the story and the telling. Today, we'll talk about both. So what inspired the idea or research that led to your business thesis? When you start preparing your presentation, your first step should be to clearly state your business thesis that you brought to I-Corps. Can you capture your inspiration and your business thesis in just a few sentences? This is a small part of your overall presentation time-wise, but it's an important framing for what will follow. In starting to tell your story, focus on this first. It can be challenging to distill a complex idea. You may think that your technology or your concept is too complex to explain in just a few sentences. Often scientists are told not to simplify or use plain language when they talk about their work. Even in non-technical sectors, there's still a knowledge base that's unfamiliar to those who are outside it. That's fine in the lab, but if you want to pursue an entrepreneurial path, you're going to need to get comfortable talking in plain language for a variety of audiences. Let me give you an example of how you might be able to do that. You may be familiar with the Large Hadron Collider, part of a complex known as CERN in Switzerland. This is just one part of it. It's the world's largest and most powerful particle accelerator. Back in 2012, CERN was preparing for some experiments to try to prove the existence of the Higgs boson to resolve the last piece of what's known as the Standard Model of Physics, a foundational piece of explaining the universe. This was big news. It was making global headlines. I was doing work for Columbia at the time, and I interviewed Mike Tutz, a physics professor there who had worked on CERN. I asked him how he would explain Higgs to somebody who was not a rocket scientist. He used a great analogy, putting things into terms anybody could relate to and understand. Now, this was 2012, and Obama was president. Tutz said, imagine you're at a cocktail party in Washington, D.C. If you want to walk from the bar to the other side of the room, it's easy. Nothing will stop you. But if President Obama was at the same party and he wanted to walk from the bar to the other side of the room, he would constantly be stopped by people who wanted to shake his hand or take a selfie or maybe have a quick conversation. These people are the Higgs field. They slow him down. You could even say they weigh him down. If you think of Obama as representing a subatomic particle, like an electron, then they, the Higgs field, give him weight. They make him a heavy particle, depending on how he interacts with them. If subatomic particles don't acquire mass, say if an electron has no mass, then you can't make an atom or a molecule or a person or anything. That's what Higgs is, and that's why it was such a big deal. That was almost a dozen years ago, and I never forgot that explanation, that story. So let's get back to your I-Corps storytelling. How does a good story start? With a connection. The more a story can draw in the listener, the more it can impact their opinion or influence their thinking. Every story has three parts: the setting, the conflict, and the resolution. The setting is the context necessary for the initial spark that led to your concept or research and your business thesis. The conflict is the obstacle or obstacles, because there may be more than one, to your goal. This is what makes your story interesting. What is the problem that you must solve? In the context of I-Corps, your team must present your journey through this process. The resolution is where the process led you. What is your path forward, and what are your next steps? Let's think about that explanation of the Higgs boson a bit more. That story resonated with me and stayed with me, and hopefully it will stay with you. Why? Because it made a connection. We've all been at a crowded party. We can imagine that scenario. That made a connection. We can all picture former President Obama or any luminary like that being stopped as they try to work their way across a room. We understood and related to the context, so we understood the analogy, even though it was explaining a complex scientific concept. So I said before that every story, no matter how complex, has three parts, and that actually holds true for that Higgs boson explanation as well. The setting is the cocktail party in Washington, D.C. Even if you haven't lived there, you can certainly picture it, whether it's from a movie or maybe West Wing or House of Cards or Scandal. The conflict is that you or I can walk across a room without an issue, but President Obama would indeed be slowed down by guests if he tried to do so. The resolution is making that analogy complete, that if President Obama is like an electron, the guests are the Higgs boson field, giving him weight and enabling the formation of all mass, from a coffee cup to the President of the United States. Why does this matter? Because the story of your I-Corps experience should also have these three parts, be concisely told and compelling. Once you've established how to start your story, and once you have this feel for how a story should be told, the next step is to focus on the journey, the process you go through in I-Corps. You may think that you are the star of your story, but in a way, your customers are really in the leading role. This is particularly true in the I-Corps approach. Coming into this program, you may have thought you knew who your customers are and what they want, but customers make you smarter. They hold the key lessons, and what they can teach you is central to where your story will take you. Be sure that your narrative includes the key lessons and insights you've learned and how they impact what you'll be doing next. The CEO of a startup that also went through an I-Corps cohort told me the customer is your hero, not you, not your product. You are just there to help them. So what elements do you need to include in your story? This is what you need to include. What was your initial idea and concept, your original hypothesis, the value proposition, your customer segments, your target markets, and then what did you do? Who did you speak to? What did you learn? Were you challenged? Was your business model canvas validated? Did you have to pivot? Were there any aha moments? And then what's next? What is your path forward? Remember, in I-Corps, focus on the journey. What is the big challenge or challenges that you face, and what is the product market fit that evolved? Be sure you're addressing all the aspects of the business model canvas that this cohort is covering. Don't include too much detail, just enough to make it interesting. Know where to start and know when to stop. So how do you bring your story to life? By being specific. Take lots of notes during customer discovery. You will need them. Think about the high impact customer discovery conversations. Go back to your notes and identify some key quotes that can help illustrate your journey. Are there visuals of your customers, screenshots of your Zoom conversations, logos that represent the organizations that you're speaking with? All of those can be useful. Are there any major ahas or oh no's, and could you articulate that on a slide? Did you have to pivot? How can you tell that part of your story? Any supporting diagrams or schematics, ecosystems, funnels can also be useful in sharing your narrative and are worth considering. So here's an example from my presentation from 2 years ago of customer insights. This is just one way that you can highlight relevant direct quotes from your customer discovery process. Remember, you are targeting at least 20 interviews. That's a lot of conversations. Take detailed notes so you can go back and find some compelling quotes to share. And here's an example of the evolution of an ecosystem from another past I-Corps presentation. This company made sustainable batteries, but they used this Super Mario motif through their ecosystem to have a little fun with it. Your I-Corps instructors can point you towards many other examples. And here's another example of a slide from my presentation where I shared my big aha pivot moment that ultimately led me into a different direction for my original business thesis. During my customer discovery process, I spoke to a company that I thought was a potential customer, but it turned out they had been exploring launching a product very much like what I had in mind. And what they found was that it wasn't resonating. It was a nice idea, but the end user didn't want to use it. They found it too cumbersome, so their clients weren't interested. Now, that was a frustrating moment for me, but it also was an important pivot, and it pushed me to go back and look to what other insights could put me towards my next steps. And this was how I articulated that in my presentation. So how you tell a story is just as important as the narrative you construct. Let's talk about telling your story. There are 3 key parts to telling a story as well, and they make a huge difference in how your audience will hear it. Understanding who your audience is and what they know, thinking about what kind of language you should use to effectively communicate your story, and how your presentation can have the greatest impact. I think the audience is often overlooked, but maybe the most critical element. Understanding your audience will enable you to make a greater connection. Remember that for your I-Corps presentation, your audience is diverse. People are coming from different backgrounds and different sectors. Avoid what's called the curse of knowledge. The actor Alan Alda has been working out of Stony Brook University. He set up an institute there to work with scientists on improving their communication, and he coined this term, the curse of knowledge. He says that if you're working in a particular area, you can forget what it's like to be naive about that knowledge. Don't assume that others know what you know. Assume that they won't get technical terms and break it down. The words you choose, the language you choose is so important, especially when talking about technology of any kind. It's critical that you distill your narrative into clear language. Lose as much jargon and lingo as you can. Avoid acronyms and certainly explain them if you need to reference them. Simplify. One of the best ways to do that is to write down and read aloud your business thesis and your notes for your presentation. That doesn't mean you have to script yourself, but if you do write it out, you'll find that you're able to determine where your language is still too technical or still too cumbersome, and you can edit that down and simplify to make your narrative more compelling. The most important way to prepare for a presentation like this is to practice, 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 and use a timer. That 8 minutes will either feel very slow or it'll go very quickly. Don't talk over your teammates. If you're presenting as a team, make sure you practice as a team as well. Now, if you're like me, you notice typos, whether you're reading an article online or sitting on the subway looking at the ads. If you're presenting, people will notice typos as well. Make sure you proofread your presentation, not just using spell check because that might miss something. Reading your slides out loud is another way to double check and proofread for typos. Finally, try to take a step back from your presentation and think about whether someone outside of this I-Corps cohort, outside of your university or institution, would get it. Would your grandma or your roommate understand? So some basic PowerPoint guidance. This is a bad slide. Don't do this. Don't overload the slides with so much information that no one can read it and they just tune out. Visuals and more limited bullet points have much more impact. Don't just read your slides, capture the main point, but then enrich it with your narrative. Schematics and diagrams can be great visually, but be sure that you can speak to the story that they tell. Also, try to avoid multimedia, links to playing video or animation, unless it's really critical to what you're presenting. If it hits a snag, and it often does, it'll throw off your audience and it'll interrupt your flow as well. So here's a checklist of everything you need to include in your presentation: your introduction and your business thesis, your customer profile, your customer discovery process, the feedback and insights you gained, the pivot points and aha moments, your customer ecosystem, an agile roadmap, and your path forward and next steps. Also, here's some quick tips to recap what we've talked about. Clarify your business thesis. Keep it to just a few sentences and then get to the good stuff. Know your audience, know who you're speaking to. Use customer feedback to illustrate what you've learned. Use simplified language and avoid jargon and technical lingo. Take advantage of office hours. I can't stress this enough. There is an amazing team of I-Corps instructors here ready to help. Use this checklist that I just shared and make sure you include everything that's required. Practice, 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 even if you're working on the presentation until just before you have to upload it. And be confident this is your idea and your hard work during this cohort. So it's time to start telling your story. Make sure that you upload your final presentation to In Your Ecosystem. The final assignment details are in your syllabus. I am also available for office hours as well, so please sign up. I hope to see you, and thank you.